panel assembles. Nathan is going to do the moderating for the panel, and I see we are mostly everyone is here, and I guess we're set to go. So Nathan.
Excellent. Yeah, so as I said, we're heading into this afternoon's panel to talk about this question of what is the future for Jamaica Bay? What is the future also for New York City and other cities? Our first panelist today is Deborah Morris, who is an urban planner, a design critic at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and an assistant adjunct professor of urban planning at Columbia University. Her work centers at the nexus of climate adaptation and social equity, including how cities manage housing opportunities in geographies facing substantial physical risk. She was formerly the executive director of resiliency planning at the New York City Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development, where she created a team focused on climate change adaptation and affordable housing. So I'll hand it over to Deborah. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm so excited to be here. Let me share my screen. Oops. So thank you for that introduction and such an interesting prompt, Nathan. As mentioned, my name is Deborah Morris. I'm an urban designer focused on climate adaptation, risk mitigation, and affordable housing. And I previously managed the City of New York's property acquisition and buyout program post-Hurricane Sandy. I want to thank the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center for hosting this discussion, as well as Richard and Nathan for including me. And I want to thank my co-panelists for sharing and all of you coming to learn. I'm starting this presentation with this image because I think in many ways it represents so much of the problem of framing in climate change response, and in particular, how discussions around storm surge and sea level rise and wildfires, we often look at this as an issue in isolation, an irresponsibly located home versus a challenging environmental force. I think this sets up a false dichotomy around root causes of vulnerability and the nature of transition. And I think it is critical we examine environmental hazard and an environmental climate crisis and how it interrelates with the human need for shelter. As our local and global population continues to grow, this means we must learn how to do more with less by using renewable energy and finding significant efficiencies in how we feed and house ourselves. And although the changing climate is making it more difficult to predict weather and severe events, what is not unpredictable is that lower income people, predominantly non-white people, locally and globally, are significantly more likely to be affected by climate change broadly and severe weather events. So what can we do? As Nathan raised in his paper, one potential solution is to look at this transition from an ecological perspective, which means to attempt to move away from risk entirely and make space for nature and water, like here as pictured in Oakwood Beach. However, rarely, if ever, does this ecological effort successfully reconcile our socio-political environment, where an acute housing shortage, income inequality, and the legacies of redlining and inclusionary zoning push people into positions of vulnerability. Coping with the daily effects of climate change is a monumental global task, and it's a challenge borne primarily by local government. Yet the experience is felt daily by its residents. So to illustrate this argument, I want to speak about housing in New York City and a little bit about the Queens side of Jamaica Bay. Access to housing is unequal. New York City is economically and racially segregated, and New York City is a city of renters. As of 2018, 2/3 of New York City residents rented their homes. Renters cross the economic spectrum from very high to very low income, and finding housing is expensive for everyone. The city's vacancy rate is 3.5%. This combination of high cost and limited availability is a daily disaster. Up to 100,000 people seek housing in an emergency shelter every night. Despite an aggressive affordable housing construction program, New York does not have housing sufficient for all who want to live here. Yet locally and regionally, construction of housing is suppressed through zoning and environmental regulations. Often in order to serve narrow interests, community members will use environmental regulations to oppose all housing development, including affordable housing, citing issues such as stormwater management and overburdened infrastructure to prevent housing construction and stoke fears of community change. In a region as dense and developed as New York, this combination of restrictions and oppositions make it virtually impossible to develop new affordable housing. The population of the New York region has grown by over 1 million residents in the last 2 decades, yet the supply of housing has stagnated, and close to 1 million people live within the city's 500-year floodplain, a number that will increase with sea level rise. A good chunk of this population lives within the Jamaica Bay water system, in housing that reflects the built environment of a dense city, which is a broad spectrum of housing types, from the apartments of Spring Creek Towers to the low-rise homes of Canarsie, but still dense, to a total combination of public housing to the beach bungalow pictured in Edgemere in the Rockaways. Edgemere is a community in the Eastern Rockaways. It is majority minority, majority low income, and half its residents live in public housing, and the other half live in 1 to 4 family homes that are predominantly owner occupied. Its residents face some of the longest commute times in the city, and it has relatively few amenities as it has been historically underinvested and disinvested. It has had significant infrastructural challenges, and like all of the Rockaways, Edgemere is entirely in the floodplain. It has a low-lying bayfront edge, making it exceptionally vulnerable to tidal flooding, and experienced significant damage after Hurricane Sandy. After Hurricane Sandy, given the substantial challenges facing people living in Edgemere, besides flood risk, the city launched a significant community planning initiative to understand how Edgemere residents understood climate risk and learn what residents felt they needed in order to thrive, including discussing the significant growing challenge of sea level rise. This 8-month effort produced the Resilient Edgemere Community Plan, which I encourage you to read. And this plan is more than just a document. It altered the way the city's disaster recovery resources were deployed, creating an enhanced buyout area to promote managed retreat, a relocation program, an attached elevated home program, all of which were funded. But I want to highlight that it included a framework for both movement away from the shoreline, here and here, looking forward, but also the development of new affordable housing in the Rockaways, like this 100-unit building, Beach Green Dunes 2. I bring up this development, which has many constructed features so the building can continue to perform as housing even during and after a significant flood event. Has its own solar array, passive house insulation to maintain temperature, and of course, there are no residential units or building mechanical systems on the first floor of the building. In my 6 years working on New York City's hurricane recovery team, I participated in hundreds of conversations with city planning staff regarding storm damaged neighborhoods and areas that face future flood risk. In discussions of policy tools and potential solutions, the major constituent was consistently framed as a homeowner, living oblivious to or in defiance of risk. Rental tenants do not fit easily into this equation. The well-being and stability of rental tenants has little to do with access to information about flood risk. Instead, it is the historic patterns of inequity and the weakness of the American safety net that creates choice-limiting constraints that place people in vulnerable homes. Buyout programs may seem like a logical and fiscally responsible solution to changing landscapes. However, without a significant investment in the development of comparably priced housing in communities without risk, and I do ask you, where are those communities? Reducing the availability of housing inventory displaces the problem and does not reduce overall human vulnerability. Currently, the city has no policy for managed retreat as part of a broader climate adaptation plan. In addition, the city's toolkit for public land acquisition, disposition, and management is governed by a set of regulations and processes that are not designed around significant or inclusive transformation in the built environment. Finally, as this is a discussion about the future, I want to expand our mindset and what is possible. Nathan concludes his white paper with the argument that raising homes and emptying out ground floor spaces is only realistic to a certain elevation and only feasible if the streets and infrastructure around them are protected from flooding. He says the city cannot reasonably expect millions of its residents to start living 20 feet higher above seawater and to do their daily business by boats. And although I agree raising structures and imagining this kind of change in our current built environment with current inequities and capital planning is sometimes hard, it is possible to imagine something else. So this is an image of former President Lyndon Baines Johnson driving an amphibious car. He used it to trick heads of state driving around, pretending the brakes were failing and then driving into a pond only to float. I'm showing this and this image of a duck boat in Boston, both different amphibious vehicles built in the 1940s through 60s, not because boat cars are the solution, but because they illustrate the potential for adaptive capacity. And although as a housing advocate, I think it is critically important we consider housing needs citywide when making changes in any community, I also think it's important that we remember that all infrastructure is man-made and we have the opportunity to think and live differently. Thank you. I look forward to your questions. I can't
Nathan,
hear you.
Nathan? Okay, Nathan, do you have you have to unmute.
Unmuted. Thank you.
Okay, and get our next speaker.
I said, thank you, Deborah. That was fantastic. And I loved the images at the end too. Looking at those amphibious vehicles. I think we're going to have a great discussion at the end of this panel. Our second panelist I'll introduce now is Illya Azaroff, who is an associate professor in the architectural technology at New York City College of Technology, and is a founding principal at Plus Lab Architect PLLC, which is a leader in disaster mitigation, resilient planning strategies, and design. He's consulted with design teams across the United States and has worked with FEMA on developing curriculum for resilience, as well as with the City of New York on its 2019 hazard mitigation plan. So I'm going to hand it over to Illya, and I look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Nathan. Let me share my screen. And it's great to see so many friendly faces today. I wanted to thank Richard and the Brooklyn Waterfront team for the invitation and to be here to talk about some of these larger strategies at play. So I'm here to talk a little bit about some of the emerging issues and items that may be part of a global dialogue, but really hit home here in New York. And how do we prepare upland communities when we do trigger strategic relocation? It's not just about the people in the place that are choosing to relocate. It's about the place that they're going to go to. So first and foremost, I do want to talk about the scale and scope of what we are talking about. And Nathan mentioned unmanaged retreat. And in fact, every minute, 24 people are displaced around the world. That's 1,440 during this 1 hour that we are together for this panel. And if we take a look back in 2020, 79.5 million people were displaced in a single year from natural and man-made disasters at a cost of $210 billion. And here's a shot of the photo of the year last year. This really puts into a nutshell, one quick shot of what we're contending with. Families on the front line, communities on the front line, infrastructure on the front line, and what does livelihood and vitality mean in the short term as well as the long term. The most recent report from the GAR has come out that really highlights and adds to the information given today. The number of disasters moving forward will increase by 40% by 2030. That's the trend that we're seeing across the world. So aside from sea level rise, all of the compound effects that come along with a warming and a warmer planet and wetter environment. And in fact, here's a shot of the number of disasters from around the world in 2021, along with the top 10 countries. So it's everywhere. So as we talk about Jamaica Bay, we really need to be talking about everywhere. It is a global issue. And in fact, the latest IPCC report already looks at the fact that over 3 billion people are living in hotspots of climate vulnerability. So let's think about that. That includes New Yorkers and folks in New Jersey and everyone on this call. And when we talk about reduction of risk, we seem to have this false narrative about 1.5 degrees Celsius, the Paris Agreement. We're going to blow past that. We're going to see that multiplier, the nonchalant kind of acceptance of 0.5 degree is a multiplier in biodiversity loss that the planet hasn't seen for millions of years. And just to take another step back of the 2021 $1 billion disasters, it's interesting that we often see a graphic like this and see that it's not just hurricanes, it's not just flooding, it's everything. But these are the $1 billion disasters. I don't see the flooding from Hurricane Ida here on this map that really impacted New York City. So we need to think about that complete narrative. And of course, it was mentioned about the growing populations, but also population migration. By 2050, 70% of us will live in urban places, and where people are moving are to the places where sea level rise and bodies of water and greater stress on resources already exists. So we have a recipe for ongoing disaster. And the shorelines in the US it's home to 39% of the population and generating almost 46% of the GDP, among other things. But it's not just there. Deborah asked, where are the safe zones? And this is the middle of the country, the Mississippi Valley and the Missouri Valley regions in some catastrophic flooding from 2019. And so how far have we come? Then Mayor Michael Bloomberg said, we will not abandon a waterfront. So I agree with that in principle, but I want to take a different look at it. Not abandoning means we need to manage the waterfronts as we look at living patterns and people do move away from them. But we do need to manage what was there. It was great to see what Nathan had shown about taking down houses, planting seagrass. How do we begin to have a sponge of a city as we move forward? Because 2 degrees Celsius, along with the information that my colleague at Stevens Institute put forward, begins to highlight the fact that this is an extraordinary time that we're living through. And with the science we have, we can see the models in front of us and we cannot deny them. So what does equity look like even under blue skies when the public is awakening to the fact that these areas of risk are the areas that we live in? Well, it's an equity issue because the property value loss, according to First Street Foundation and their studies, is profound. Multi-generational housing is dropping like a rock. So how do I keep equity and where do I move? Back to Deborah's point, where are the zones of safety? I think that's great. It was also wonderful to see all of these amazing maps. I'm an architect, but I'm also a geographer. My first degree is in geography. And so I love seeing these maps to really look at the fact that it's not just people in these places, it's everything else. This is a city in itself that's in these inundation zones by 2021, including 80 schools and daycare centers and public housing facilities and hospitals and nursing homes. It's everything that's in those zones. But the point about the adaptive communities and resilient communities are adaptive communities. If we think of resilience as action, then we can think about where people live and how they live in a much different way. And we also need to recognize emerging systems. The world gave us a lesson for COVID-19, not a harsh lesson to learn, unfortunately, but we've emerged from that or beginning to emerge with newer ideas of living. And I do want to put a finer point on this idea of the Band-Aid. There is a purpose for a lot of the infrastructure and the work that's being done for elevation. It actually pushes the timeline back of criticality when you have no choices left. So when you do elevate a home and you do these things, it is temporary. And if we recognize that holistically, that it's temporary, we've bought more time to make the harder decisions and the real solutions. But that infrastructure investment sometimes is at folly. And it's not only the people and the infrastructure, it's everything else. It's about society, it's about the biosphere, it's about economy, it's about all of the SDGs to make a vibrant community. And when we think about adaptation and resilience, from my sector, everyone talks about carbon reduction. Well, look, the train left the station. We may slow global warming, but the effects of global warming need adaptation and resilience. So the 2030 challenge that I'm interested in that really supports strategic relocation is really the Sendai framework. Substantial reduction, pulling people out of harm's way. And in fact, the recent UN report really looked at the global cost of climate adaptation. And by 2050, this singular fund is going to be funding about $500 billion of needed projects throughout the world. But be clear, there are trillions of dollars in ESG funding now on the table around the world because the world understands that this is the major issue that we have in front of us globally. And one of the things that why Richard and I talked about this, and he asked me to be here, is to talk a little bit about the Goldilocks zones. Where are there zones of safety and security? Well, part of the work that I've been doing is with the Resilient 21 team that helped the Biden administration understand what the first 100 days look like. And part of that work that's come forward from the Biden administration has asked every department for an adaptation plan. You can go on and look, and these all need ideas, and there's funding behind them. But to enter that safety zone, which I mentioned, which we are calling the Goldilocks Zone, very similar to NASA and scientists looking for Goldilocks planets, those that could safely support life. Where do they exist? Where are the zones of least risk, not just today, but in the future? The shifting climate zones around the United States and the world need adaptive ecosystems, and new hazards are being introduced into areas that didn't have those hazards before. It is a serious issue that we are contending with because we have very little time. These are the near-term already shifted climate zones identified in the United States that have really turned some of these areas on their head. And the long-term look is quite profound. So I'm working on the New York State Climate Impact Assessment with a great team of people. And part of our work is really examining across the state today and in the future where the greatest hazards exist and impacts to our buildings, people, places, society, ecosystems, and every sector that makes who we are today. And so part of that is looking at these pieces of where flooding are, flood projections, and climate change, shifting climate zones, living patterns, stormwater. It also looks at biomes, how the regions support people, and the ecologies, how planting areas and ecosystems will shift. And when you begin to look at this data, there is some shifts going on that we're discussing openly and talking about this for investment. And the reason is that we do recognize that people will need to move from the zones of great hazard, and that the limited amount of funds necessary to keep coastal areas safe will not be available all times and in the future. So we need to find areas with lower risk profiles over time. Climate change impacts and understand what ecosystems and food production is in those areas, and identify areas that have carrying capacity that is very high now, or has potential to be very high for receiving more populations. And those candidates of those receiver communities, we need to invest in improving the infrastructure to prepare for greater human traffic, build capacity that for an increased population across all sectors, including food production and ecosystems. Part of the suggestions that we're putting forward to the governor's office. But the wider benefits of adaptation, when we think about strategic relocation, managed retreat, again, it's not the people. It really looks at the equity. It looks at good health and well-being and reducing inequity across all sectors, not just poverty, but access to food, access to jobs and livelihood. And then, of course, life on land and below water is what you leave behind to increase and regenerate the world is at hand. So this is one thing I'm going to leave you with. So you at home and in the audience can do this yourself to begin to look at this. FEMA has a wonderful tool that you can zoom into an exact property, and you can look at every hazard that's available and start to look at your risk index. With the risk index, you also look at annual loss, the social vulnerabilities, as well as community resilience. This is one of the many tools. This is one of the easier accessible tools that are out there. And if you zoom in and look at the communities in and around New York City, it really does begin to paint a picture for you about general vulnerabilities and areas that might have a greater capacity for living, for commerce, and other things. And these are the areas as part of an assessment, which might mean investment in the future, to pull people out of harm's way and to spend money in a much more effective way for a better future. So I just wanted to introduce that as a topic today. Looking forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. There was really a lot of fantastic ideas in there to unpack. We're going to move on to our next panelist. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. Our next panelist is William Salecki, who is a professor in the Department of Geography at Hunter College. From 2006 to 2014, he served as the director of the CUNY Institute for Sustainable Studies at Hunter College. He has co-led several climate impact studies in the greater New York and New Jersey region, including the New York City Panel on Climate Change, and was also a lead author on the IPCC Working Group 2 Urban Areas chapter, and a coordinating lead author of the U.S. National Climate Assessment chapter on urbanization, infrastructure, and vulnerability. So I'll hand it over to William. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. Can everyone hear me? Something good. I've had some internet issues today, so I apologize. I'm trying to get everyone in the house to slow down their streaming. Hopefully it'll work out. If not, just send me up a high sign. So I'm going to share some slides as well. So thanks, thanks Nathan, and thanks Richard and others for organizing this great event. And it seems just like I've been watching as much as I can over the course of the day, just really inspired discussions. So I'm really happy to contribute to that. So one of the issues that I look at here is, this question of, which is sort of undercurrent throughout the day, is what will happen to the communities around Jamaica Bay. And of course, we've already heard earlier in the morning, this sort of interconnection between the water and the communities is sort of very much kind of, foundational to the building of these communities and their current state and their future. So these places are inexorably linked with that. One of the things that I've been particularly interested in, in this sort of discussion, is what can we learn from other types of research and other work that's been done in this space related to dynamic conditions in cities, and what does this literature speak to, and how might it be of some use as we start to sort of look into this question of coastal retreat practice. So I also am a geographer. And I've been looking at sort of trying to plumb the depths of like urban geography work, hazards geography work, many other sort of intersecting literatures that kind of have speak to this question of communities under stress and in crisis. So what can we glean from this literature to better understand what might happen in the context of communities as they and individuals and households as they get increased stress from the potential risk of an advanced sea level rise. So under what conditions do residents decide to relocate or are forced to relocate? What are some of the significant factors that influence their decision-making process? And when they make a decision, where, when, and what are some of the other kind of relocational decisions, like where do they go? Do they go close? Do they go far? Et cetera, et cetera. And then of course, underpinning a lot of this conversation is what are some of these, the fundamental equity and justice questions that sort of remain sort of at the core in terms of how, urban landscape transformation does take place. Some of this work is reflected in an annual review of public health that I wrote with a colleague highlighted here. This actually goes into a little bit more of the psychology side, but it might be of interest to many in this context. So let me go to the next slide here. So one of the things that sort of gets me sort of interested in this question as well is the recognition that there are these sort of different dimensions of risk that communities, that households, communities, stakeholders, practitioners, et cetera, have to sort of grapple with. And of course, we've heard some examples, and this is some of the work that was done when I was more connected with the New York City panel on climate change, the most recent sort of data on sea level rise projections for the city of New York. And so we have some understanding under some of these more extreme scenarios, what might be inundated, what parts of the landmass currently above water will be permanently inundated. Of course, that is an existential issue in terms of land literally disappearing. But then we also go into other conditions where this sort of extreme flooding event, and so we can look at this map, we've seen many already over the course of the day. This shows you the 1% flood zone in and around Jamaica Bay. And what we basically did is a very simple sort of bathtub illustration, taking that same flood line and adding different scenarios of sea level rise with an expectation across different time slices of this next century. And of course, you see this sort of graduated more inland motion of that same flood event. So these are sort of like singular events, Hurricane Sandy type events. Of course, Hurricane Sandy was probably like a 1 in 400 year event or 500 year event. There's, it's difficult to sort of navigate some of these statistics or sort of estimate, but this is sort of also an estimate of a 1% or a 1 in 100 year type event. And you see this sort of inland motion of water. And then the other sort of thread that I think is particularly challenging in some ways, and maybe really not, as highlighted in this discussion, is this sort of mean monthly flooding or high tide flooding or mean monthly high tide flooding. We know throughout the eastern seaboard of the United States, we're seeing more and more of this as a chronic type of exposure. And that sort of has, more subtle, but potentially more impactful types of effects on residency, quality of life, and the occupancy capacity in communities and decisions to relocate. So what I'm going to do now is just for a few minutes is just to kind of really very briefly encapsulate some of this literature and get us sort of thinking about it, like what geographers and urban planners and urban studies people and urbanists more broadly have talked about in terms of some of these things that might be relevant for understanding of retreat as a practice. So I think one of the things that's really quite central in all this is the concept of home and what that means to people, the conditions of home, and what kinds of factors sort of mediate one's connection to home, and that there is clearly this sort of emotional connection that very much is embedded in our everyday experience. And that this is connected to specific landscapes, particular social interactions, social networks, social cues, physical cues, site cues, et cetera, and that this becomes a defining element of one's existence. So anytime that this process is sort of changed or disrupted, either through a storm or through any kind of acute event, Richard started the day talking about salesthesia as a sort of sense of loss of relation to the connection to place. And so one of the things we can speak about in this context of climate change impacts in places like Jamaica Bay, this notion of loss of sense of place. And certainly after Hurricane Sandy, there are many of these stories about the flooding, the impact, devastation of home, and the implications. So we see this as sort of a chronic emerging process, and the implications of that can be pretty profound. When we talk about this idea of significant urban transformations or sort of changes in the landscape, this is also going to sort of influence, people's connectivity to that place. If they're perceived as sort of, some upgrading, there might be enhanced connectivity. So we see some of these resiliency efforts might give a sense, maybe false, to be debated, a sense of security and protection. But of course, it also changes the nature of these communities as well, and how people connect with them, as well as getting into some of the housing prices and sort of affordability of some of these locations. Also, when people live in places of increasing risk, the notion of place attachment becomes really powerful to help them understand how they sort of mediate this increasing threat. There was a really interesting piece of work that came out in the 1990s, extensive survey of people living in what was then sort of very much devastated, disinvested communities. And there was still a very strong sense of connection to place and commitment to place, even though that by many metrics, the risk levels had significantly increased. So this becomes an important way of sort of thinking about what adaptation planning might mean in the context of places with increasing risk. And overall, this sort of place attachment also will heavily influence one's perception of risk and what's facing them and what they can sort of potentially respond to. Another thread on this is this idea of place permanence. Like if you look through the urban studies literature writ large, of course, there are examples of places that don't exist anymore and places, but overall, the literature is quite rich with the notion that places rarely disappear. In fact, there is this sort of sense of continuance that oftentimes comes in many places, even through struggles, even through various disasters. That doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't inequities or transformations that take place in these locations, but there is this sense of permanence. And one of the really prominent authors on this, in general, a lot of this can be driven in times by the wealthy, and there's sort of this disadvantaged conditions that emerge with the poor and disadvantaged in these communities. These shocks, these tremors, these threats to communities oftentimes lead to enhanced or further further inequity or enhanced inequity. That being said, there's also even in these contexts, even for those left more marginal, there is this strong sense of connection to place, and the idea of remaining in place and sort of remaining in these sort of social networks. So the idea, if you look at the idea of lock-in and this social cohesion, both in terms of the social networks, but the physical landscape is really powerful. That being said, there are lots of examples throughout the world, throughout the city of New York, where places remain, but the communities, the populations within them don't. And so this gets into this idea of like, how do we understand these sort of social dynamics that occur in cities, and what can we say, what can we reference from that into the questions of like what managed retreat or the practice of retreat might mean. So we have, of course, this very rich literature, which has been referenced here and there, on residential mobility dynamics, development pressure, segregation, dislocation. Of course, there's a really extensive, literature that speaks to all of these sort of social dynamics and the social processes embedded with them, and the implications. And typically, what happens, these sort of dynamic real estate processes, as I mentioned earlier, kind of continue and the notions of social inequity, even though when there is dislocation, when there is physical dislocation or choice dislocation, people don't typically move very far. So I think these are important sort of things to sort of recognize. And of course, we've seen obviously a rich literature on gentrification now being applied to green and climate contexts. I think we need to continue that work as we sort of look at some of these planned relocation activities. We, of course, also have this idea of these sort of large catastrophic sorts of events, and sort of trying to understand the social dynamics which those, create in places like New Orleans. This is following Hurricane Katrina, seeing where people dispersed and where some of those FEMA requests came from. Obviously, a lot in and around New Orleans, but extended throughout the United States. But if we see, New Orleans in 2020, 2021, we see a really dynamically changed kind of community. Of course, the African-American community has lost a significant of its population share. A lot of forced relocation or dislocation occurred in the immediate aftermath of that storm. They have not moved back, but other parts of the city have started to grow and actually are much higher densities than we saw pre-Katrina 15 years ago. So I just want to, close again, just to sort of start a conversation about what we can learn from this literature. So in general, I think the things that you can come out from the literature is that people resist moving, right? Until there's a clear net benefit of moving, or if they're literally forced out. And acute events and sort of immediate aftermath of these events are really key in this process. But there is, of course, that underlying chronic issue that we need to understand as well. People really like to hold on to their social networks. People, if they're going to be moving or choose to move or forced to move, they're going to move nearby. So I think this sets in motion a set of questions about what are some of the adjoining communities around Jamaica Bay, what the implications might be for them. There's limited evidence of these sort of longer distances. We do see a lot of evidence of solastalgia or other sort of, mental health related sort of traumas associated with this sense of loss, in a range of different contexts, so we need to be understanding of that. Urbanization and community change, of course, is highly contested. Managed retreats or managed programs. In other ways, we see the picture of the community destruction in the building of Lincoln Center. The building of public housing was a trauma to the city of New York in terms of what it meant in terms of dislocation, under the guise of sort of rational planning. I think we need to be very careful, recognizing that managed retreat has that imprimatur of a rational approach, but the implications of that have to be done in the context of equity. For those that have choice, risk perception is, plays a key role in understanding the events sort of circling around them and the implications of their decision making. And I think we need to further understand how people deal with this idea of acute risk, like a trauma from a major storm event, versus the chronic flooding that you might have with mean monthly high tides. How many times, a month or a year do you have to sort of swap out your basement or walk to your house on crates or something like that to make you want to sort of relocate? And I think just, ending off very quickly here, this idea that, social construction of risk and the embedded nature of a lot of the adaptation resiliency planning efforts that's been proposed really sort of don't yet fully address some of these power issues that you see between communities and the entities that are developing them, issues of trust, conflicts over the value of different forms of knowledge. I know the city of New York has begun a very ambitious effort to sort of, connect these issues and sort of, develop a more, interactive community-based planning effort. But I think this is that those efforts and more will probably be really drawn upon as we get into the space of managed retreat. So thanks so much. Hopefully this sort of sparks some thoughts.
Thanks so much, William. That was fantastic. So many great ideas there too to consider. And some terms I wasn't as familiar with, like solastalgia. Our next panelist is Adowu Jola Ajibade, who is an assistant professor of geography at Portland State University. Her research focuses on how individuals, communities, and cities respond to global climate change and their different capacities for adaptation and transformation. She explores adaptation in the context of resilience planning, eco-industrialization, eco-gentrification, uneven development, and managed retreat. Ajibade's work has been featured in many academic journals and media outlets, including NPR, Science Friday, Yale Environment 360, and Vice. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Richard, for inviting me. I want to thank the Brooklyn Water Research Center as well for this invitation, and many thanks to my panelists as well. So much I'm just listening to everyone. I don't have a PowerPoint slide because I really just wanted to talk to people based on some of the research I've done around the world, but also on some of the literature that is out there, what we're learning in terms of the effect of retreat on people, how this is happening. And so I will just be sharing a few thoughts, and I will try to keep my intervention relatively short. So in my mind, I actually see a retreat and relocation as an act, or if you like, as a bridge between the choices and failures of the past and potentially the success of the future. We've learned, like we've learned from some of the presentations today, the sea level rise, or when the sea rises in different parts, including Jamaica Bay, the current risk mitigation and billion-dollar sea levels, sea walls and dikes that we're seeing may not be enough to actually allow people to deal with certain sea level rise projections. So that's one thing to bear in mind. There is also the other issue where retreat, which certainly may become important or is already becoming important in many parts of the world. Retreat, like any other adaptation strategies, produces uneven impact, as we've heard from other folks speaking, who've spoken today. And so we know that relocating communities, there are challenges when people retreat. We also know that there could be challenges even for receiving communities. And the question of who is being moved or who is moving and to where and when certainly matters. So relocation as an act of adaptation, the key issue, I think, for many communities is that it must not further marginalization and it must not reproduce socio-ecological inequalities. And that's really the key point for many of the communities that I've worked in and so many other literature that people have documented. So if people must relocate, how can relocation be done in ways that create compounding benefits rather than compounding risks, marginality, or even further disasters? And that's the key issue. From some of the work that I have been doing and some papers on the review, we documented about 150 relocation plans that have already taken place. And we were able to divide that into 5 different types of relocation that we saw. One was, or you could use the word retreat. There are all kinds of ways people say resettlement, retreat, or relocation. And so we see some that are techno-managerial, which is really the ones that people resist the most, which is basically about moving people from point A to B and solely focused on risk reduction and not much. There is also the eco-restorative approaches. And I think one of the speakers today did mention it later, and certainly Nathan also talked about after people are relocated, there is a salt marsh that can be revised. There is also wetlands that can be also improved. There are storm management that could occur. There is also opportunities for parks and recreation to happen after people have relocated. And we saw that in many parts of the world, but we also see that that's happening in New York as well. We've also seen many cases of compensatory relocations where people are given buyouts or given a land or given new houses, or in some cases new farmland, where they swap their existing farmland or existing house for a new opportunity elsewhere. And here in the US, basically what we see is a lot of buyouts happening. So we've seen those kind of examples, and all of these cases have their own justice and equity challenges. And there is the other one we've also documented, which is a reformative examples, as we called them in the work that I've been doing, which is really about wholesale community working together to relocate from a particular area that is repetitively flooded and move into a new area. And so pulling resources together, and sometimes also getting resources from the state or from the federal government, and planning where they want to go and how they want to rebuild those places. And there are also cases where we've seen relocation that are transformative, which I'll focus a little bit more in my talk today. But the one other key thing I want to mention is that all of these types of relocation, there are examples where they are proactive, where before the flood becomes unbearable, people anticipate or look at some of the data that is existing and some of the data that were shared today, and they decide we have to move before it gets worse. We don't need to wait to 2030 or 2080 or 2100. We know this is getting worse and we have to move. And so they plan and they move. And there are other examples, like we've seen after Hurricane Sandy, that it's because of a major focusing or major storm events that led to the relocation happening. And so those are some of the reactive cases. And there could be techno-managerial cases that are reactive. There could be eco-restorative cases that are reactive or proactive. So we're seeing all kinds of approaches to how people are relocating globally. So key lessons that I really want to pull out is I want to focus more on the transformative cases, or at least the ones that we thought were transformative. And these was lessons drawn from Fiji and lessons drawn from Puerto Rico. Those two cases particularly allowed for a holistic and encompassing way of thinking about relocation. So it went beyond this techno-managerial approaches of just managing people and land and saying, I'm moving people from point A to point B. So it goes beyond that approach and thinking about how can relocation be accompanied by structural changes that enhance the capabilities of people to lead the kinds of lives they want and to preserve their culture and livelihoods. So some transformative cases like that, and there were some reformative cases that did allow people to lead the kinds of life they want in a new location. But there are 10 key things that I will pull from those types of relocation. One was agency and self-determination of people. The people that were relocating, they were able to choose the new locations they wanted to go to, the types of housing they wanted. Some of them actually participated in constructing the housing themselves and also in designing those houses. So these types of relocation that really centers people's agency and self-determination allowed for new forms of placemaking and rootedness through culturally appropriate housing and design that also fostered people's cultural identity. And that's key. I think Bill Solecki was talking today a lot about place and place displacement, or people's sense of place being affected by relocation. These types of relocation, when people are allowed to decide, they themselves can create those new forms of placemaking and rootedness. Another issue was they were also able to maintain ties to originating sites. So for instance, in the case of Fiji, where the community relocated from a coastal area, they moved inland to a hopper area within the same location, but they could go back and fish in the coastal area if they wanted to, but they didn't have to live there anymore. So those types of transformative and reformative relocations actually allow people to still have ties to originating sites. So that problem with the sense of loss of place was minimized. And so people were not seeing those places as completely erased, but they were seeing it as resettlement and relocation as a form of land expansion, where these other land can be used differently, while the new location can become the place where people actually just live their lives. Another issue, the second important issue, is the issue of decision making. We noticed that decision making for some of those successful cases were not driven by emergency concerns. They were not driven or compelled by humanitarian concerns. Many of those relocations that were proactive and successful, they were actually more well thought through multilateral participatory processes that took over a decade in some cases, in some other cases 5 years. So people were looking in the future, planning, and then they moved. And so these things takes time. The other issue is also the issue of extensive preparation and site inspection took place before people relocated. There was also discussions around maintaining family and cultural networks and ties, which was also maintained when people relocated. There was, the important thing was the access of people to social safety nets, which was actually supported by different institutions where people got better jobs in the new locations where they relocated to. They got better access to food, better access to infrastructure as well. Another important element is also the issue of land rights and property rights when people relocate. We know in the US here and several other countries, the concerns that people have around gentrification and loss of homes. And so when people relocated, for instance, the case of Fiji, they were able to create a land trust which guaranteed their homes. And so those are key things that are important as we look into relocating, or if people decide to relocate in future from areas that are facing repetitive flooding and sea level rise, ensuring that the new locations they are going guarantees their property and land rights will be important for many communities. Another issue is also the issue of risk mitigation in the new sites. I don't think there's any part of the world that is free of climate change impacts. So you may relocate people from areas that are facing flood of repetitive flooding or sea level rise, but then they move to an area where there is possibly earthquake, or in some cases it's landslide. And so like in the case of Fiji, people moved from an area that was facing coastal erosion and flooding, but then they moved to a place that did have concerns around landslide, but people were aware of that and they started implementing risk mitigation measures in those locations. And so when people relocate, or when the government, so our communities come together to relocate, they have to also be aware of the risks in the new location and to prepare risk mitigation strategies in those new locations. Which also brings me to the issue of acceptance of trade-offs, right? There is the issue whether you're relocating from, Jamaica Bay and moving inland somewhere, upstate New York, there will be things that people will lose and there will be things that they would gain. And so having that honest conversation about what could be gained and what could be lost is important to allowing people think not just in terms of the future, for them to also come to terms with the realities of what it means to relocate in response to climate change. Another element, an important one, I think, for many of those successful cases was also the improvement in access to infrastructure and also improvement in people's social, financial, economic, and cultural capital. So centering these 10 elements that I've just talked about, I think will be important when we're thinking about relocation policies and governance frameworks. It is important to really center communities' agency and self-determination, as well as other things I've just talked about. I do want to quickly mention also that we know that relocation or retreat does not happen in a vacuum. It is about the access of people to land, to water, to food, and to other resources, and how these resources are being redistributed. Well, and by redistribution, I mean redistributed across class, across race, across gender lines. Hence, it is important for us to center justice in all of its dimension when we're thinking about managed retreat. And by justice, I mean issues around social justice, who is getting the access to which land, who is getting access to buyouts, and when are they getting that access to the buyouts? And is the money they are getting, is it enough for them to be able to get the housing they want in the location that they want? We also need to think about environmental justice. Right? Who is making the decisions about when to relocate and where to relocate? And what is the distributive impact of relocation on different communities and different actors? Is it that when people relocate from, let's say, from Jamaica Bay, if it's not turned into, in perpetuity into a recreational area, can property developers come in future and take over those places? We've seen that happen elsewhere where I work in Lagos, where we're seeing a lot of development on the coast. How do you ensure that there is environmental justice when we're thinking about relocation plans in the long term, or even in the short term as well? Also, how do we think about restorative justice? That relocation allows for restoring a lot of things that people have lost in the past. How do we ensure ecological justice, where we're thinking beyond the benefits to human, but also thinking about other non-human species or more than human species? But also, how do we think about the impact of relocation on future generations? Who are the people that will be benefiting from the new areas, and who are the people that may benefit from areas that are left behind? These different justice dimensions needs to be honestly discussed when any relocation plan is been put in place, and different actors need to come together to center all of these dimensions of justice. Lastly, it is natural for people to resist moving to a new location. I've relocated a couple of times, but I've also resisted relocation in certain periods of my life. And this is not unusual because of the uncertainty, that people have about the new places they are going to, the fear of the unknown. I think we all have those fears sometimes. Yet resettlement, especially in the context of climate change, can be a path forward. And by a path forward, I mean an opportunity to integrate adaptation, climate mitigation, sustainable land use pattern, and regenerative livelihoods that honors communities' agency and self-determination. In other words, relocation, and particularly transformative relocation, can be seen as a form of abolition. By that, I mean a way to figure out how to work with people to create something new, rather than figuring out how to erase something. It is about redesigning the urban space or urban spaces with infrastructure, services, and forms of livability that matters to people. It is about re-envisioning alternatives, alternative land use, alternative future, alternative forms of social relations and rootedness, alternative livelihoods and energy use, and really creating new forms of solidarity and fairness and justice, even as we plan for this relocation or in response to current and future climate change. I would just end with this by saying, what is transformative for one community may not necessarily be transformative for others. So it is important to really put community at the forefront of the plan and to work with them to implement the kinds of relocation that they believe will work for them the most. Thank you for listening, and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I love all of the ideas you presented just about retreat as a space of possibility. And I think really kind of considering it under more that umbrella of like transformative adaptation. This, I think, will lead well into our next panelist as well. Our next panelist is Vanessa Keith, who is a registered architect and the principal of Studioteca, an award-winning design firm founded in 2003, which is based in Dumbo, Brooklyn. Keith explores visionary solutions to the issues faced by cities as they adapt to climate change, and her book 2100, A Dystopian Utopia, The City After Climate Change, develops case studies for the futures of 14 cities around the world in the year 2100 as they tackle the climate crisis. Keith has also taught architecture, urban design, and development practice at Columbia University, the University of Pennsylvania, City College of New York, and the Pratt Institute. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Really interesting presentations. It's great to be among such great company, and thank you guys for inviting me. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen. And the Zoom thing is in my way. Hold on a second. Can everyone see my screen? Yes? Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 2100, A Dystopian Utopia, The City After Climate Change, which is a book that I wrote that was published by Michael Sorkin's Terraform in 2017. Since then, we've been just on a mission to get the word out and to reach as many people with this message as we can. The idea is not to go to 4 degrees in the year 2100, but the idea is that everything that we're presenting here is something that someone somewhere is researching and developing that we could start to implement now, so we don't have to go to a 4-degree world. So this is a quote from the book. How can we mobilize to change the future for the better? Climate change unquestionably represents the biggest challenge to the continued presence of humankind or any other species on this planet. Managing and attempting to limit the effects of global warming should be our biggest project, prompting us to marshal our collective will, energy, and creativity to design a livable solution to the inevitable shifts in weather and habitat. So this is just giving you a little bit of a background on me and my office, Studioteca, what we've been doing. We are currently obsessed with the environment, climate change, and the role that architecture can play in solving this crisis. On the right-hand side, you can see me with one of the people from Project Drawdown. We met at a conference together that was put together by Drawdown at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck. Some other talks, there was one in Carnegie Mellon. This is some stuff that we're doing in the office currently with some of my students at Columbia and Penn, where we are transforming the cities of the book into virtual reality. It's an interesting moment to re-envision human life across the globe and how we live and interact with one another. So I am from Jamaica, the island, and We don't really have much prospect for managed retreat, except to perhaps go up into the mountains. But when these storms come, they are much, much bigger than where we are. So I invite everyone to consider, what would you do if you could not retreat? Because many of us don't have that option. We have to stay and fight. And I think the stay and fight option means that what you can do for Jamaica Bay, what we can do for New York City, for all of these communities are things that we should really be trying to do now as much as possible. Yes, some retreat is definitely necessary, but there's a lot more that we can be doing. How do we as human beings function as a system? What's the economics of it, and how can we work to make a positive change? So these are, again, some other talks that I've been invited to. I was the keynote at the Louisville Sustainability Summit. We talked at City College on Sandy, has the climate changed? And just here, I don't know if this Zoom thing is sort of in the way, but here I'm just going to talk a little bit about 2100, and I'm going to jump into the most recent work that we've been doing. So in collaboration with our partners, my office Studioteca is building the world of 2100, a dystopian utopia in VR as an open world. The reason we're doing that is we're very invested in how we can motivate and inspire change. How can we reach people? Because the crisis that we have is not a crisis of tools or techniques or technologies or know-how or any of that. It's a crisis of imagination and political will. So by immersing people in worlds that imagine potential future realities to generate empathy, the all-encompassing nature of the medium impacts all of your senses, replacing the physical space around you with something new and allowing us to dream bigger. Envisioning hopeful futures is the first step towards generating them. So below you're seeing some of the extraction cities, which are in the part of the world which is going to be less safe for large-scale populations, which includes all of New York, and the compact megacities, which are places that will have to expand population in a 4-degree world. Oops. So the year is 2100. The world is now an average of 4 degrees warmer. The UK is an archipelago of hilltop islands. Bangladesh has lost 1/3 of its fertile land. Wildfires sweep up and melt the remaining mountain glaciers of the alpine slopes. Is this the future we want? I say no. Hopefully you do too. So if you look here at 4 degrees, all of this orange stuff is pretty much difficult to maintain large-scale populations in, and that's much of where we live. One of the reasons for that are areas of increased cyclonic storms, hurricanes. You can see here that at 4 degrees, hurricanes impact pretty much all of the United States. Sea level rise is not as much the issue, which you can see these little pieces here, as is warmer oceans creating larger and larger storm surge. So we started looking at how do we solve this problem? So what if we only used renewable energy at current levels of consumption? And there was a thing some of you may have heard of, the carbon wedges thing. We need 7. So 7 wedges of wind is this much space in the United States times 7. So that's quite a lot of space. Solar is somewhat less, but still a lot of space. Just to give you some examples, a wedge of wind power would require a combined area roughly the size of Germany for the entire world. A wedge of solar is half the size of Switzerland. New forests would have to be established over an area the size of the contiguous United States for 1 wedge. So clearly that's not going to work. Our current ways of living and ways of operating in cities are not going to work. So where in the world can we live? So the areas that you see in green are areas that are going to be more stable for large scale populations. So if we're looking at 4 degrees, we're looking at a massive managed retreat away, with large scale populations moving away from all of these areas. The areas in the middle that you see on the right over here, I don't know if you can see my mouse. However, we can generate a lot of renewable energy from these areas. Again, I'm going to underscore, this is not the world that I want. My whole point in writing this as a dystopian utopia is that the things that I'm going to show you are things that we should be doing now. So our way of using land, our land use, the way that we live, the way that we have separation of different types of functions in cities is no longer sustainable. So if we continue with the same land use patterns that we have now, we need 450% more earth than we actually have. So that's not sustainable, right? So some of the other things on here, we're talking about different things that we can do. We can do vertical farming. We can do, some of this stuff is probably familiar to you, reforestation, vegetarian diets. There are other things that we can do. So in New York at 4 degrees, what we're positing is that New York has become the storm energy capture center of the Western Hemisphere. So I'm going to show you a little bit of this case study, and then I'm going to go into a little bit more of how we envision the future of cities in 2100. So land availability, use, and energy use. So if we are going to only have large scale populations in those green areas, we have a vastly reduced land area for living and food production. One of the things, again, we're still, crossing our fingers for 1.5, but it's not looking entirely plausible. One of the things that is very frustrating to me is that 2050 projections, we could have 80% renewable is technically possible, but politically unlikely. That needs to change, and that starts with all of us. So is it possible? Yes, but we need drastic change. So in order to maintain or increase current living standards for all, we need to densify, we need to go vertical, we need vastly increased efficiency through technological innovation and techniques such as soft edges at the shoreline to blunt the forces of waves, rebuilding wetlands to absorb flooding, vastly decreased energy for transportation and buildings, food sources near centers of population. I mentioned vegetarian diets already, and hybrid spaces combining farming, energy generation, recreation, and other uses. So this is our New York City waterfront case study. We looked at the Gowanus Canal, but the things that we are showing apply to all of coastal New York. So you can see here, this is in 2014. By 2050, flooding has already enlarged the size of the canal, and by 2100 at 4 degrees, this is what we have. And so what you can see here in the master plan is we've got soft edges here, which absorb water. This here is a storm surge barrier, which you're going to see closing in one of our videos. And we've repurposed and done adaptive reuse to the existing buildings, building on top of them so that the lower levels can be allowed to flood. So here you can see a section through the energy production zone. What we're envisioning is that if we have a graduated approach and we have a series of these storm surge barriers, which are in use now in the Netherlands, soft edges and all of these things to blunt the forces of the waves, by the time the waves get here in the canal, we can actually use that power to power tidal turbines so that we can generate renewable energy. These devices that you see here are capturing energy and from wind and also CO2. So here you see the calm state, and you can see the soft edges along the waterfront. And now we're going to go into storm state. So how can we envision potential futures in VR? Stanford University's Virtual Human Interaction Lab found that if a person has a VR experience of cutting down a tree, feels the chainsaw vibrate, hears the tree crash, that person is much more likely to conserve paper. Using virtual reality to change human behavior works, but how does it work, and what kinds of experiences can most effectively reach the largest number of people and have the most impact? So these are some of the questions that we're asking ourselves now. Here you can see a scene from the game that we're developing, and you can see the storm surge barrier, which is in the process of closing. This is actually the bridge that the F train runs on, which we've repurposed. So all hope is not lost. These tough survivors are working hard to bring the Earth, now a hostile planet, back from the brink. In the virtual world, each player will make choices impacting their own life as well as the lives of others in gameplay. 2100 is an MMO light where players become fully immersed in the exciting future cities of the world. They will connect as a community by completing in-game quests that can stop the advance of climate change. These quests will then connect virtual missions with real-world activities. So that's something that's very important to us. So now I'm just going to go over some of the cities so that you can just see a sort of snapshot of them. So this is Johannesburg, South Africa. So this is a compact megacity. This is some place that is going to, it's going to have to densify. There's going to be an increase in population. In this case study, we started asking ourselves how we can live more in harmony with nature and with animals. We're creating a devastation, not only for ourselves, but also for every species on the planet. So we're envisioning here that there would be habitats underneath this elevated city, and then also in the facades of the buildings, which you're going to see. So the coexistence of humanity and nature is a reality. So our idea here is that we would try to separate the human areas and the wildlife areas and coexist and create cities that enable us to have both. So in Wellington, New Zealand, which is another compact megacity, the idea here is that we've created towers which utilize some of the same technology that was used in New York in the Low Line, which some of you may have heard about. So collect water, grow food, generate clean energy, and capture carbon. What if you could scale a vast vertical forest stretching 2,800 feet into the sky? Feel the warmth of the sun deep below the ground as you farm, play, and swim in a suspended waterfall. So I'm going to show you some videos of these. So this is the exterior of the building, which is used for wind power as well as for plant growth. The more plant growth we have, the more CO2 we're absorbing. This is the inside of that same tower, which has vertical farms and growing areas inside the building. So in Moscow, which is another compact megacity, we're envisioning, again, like for each place, we've looked at very specifics in terms of the site and what it's going to experience at 4 degrees. So on this site, we're looking at adding additional density to the existing city, as well as reforestation and rewilding. So here you can see the exterior of a vertical farm, which has an algae facade as well as wind power integrated into the facade of the building. You're also seeing a Zeppelin, which is the primary mode of transporting goods in this world. This is within the city limits, right? So we're looking at rewilding. The things that you see on the ground are actually generating energy from the movement of people and other things over them. You're also seeing wind power. So New York, last but not least, hurry, a fast moving category 7 storm is approaching New York City. We thought 5 categories is probably not enough for 4 degrees. Sirens are blaring and the city is humming with activity. We need your help. It's up to you to prevent the underwater turbines and energy park from being destroyed. You must close the storm surge barriers, enter the eye of the hurricane, and survive. This is a street scene. And this is along the energy park that's near the river that we saw in the film. You can also see that we've retrofitted existing buildings and the bridge. This is another street scene. You can see that all of the surfaces of the built environment are given over to reforestation as well as energy generation. And this is the bridge and the storm surge barriers. Also along the edge of the water, you can see inflatable storm surge barriers as well. So this concludes my presentation, and we're asking, where in the world can we live? We would love to speak to you if you are interested in this work, and you can reach us at info@studioteca.com. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Vanessa. One quick question: how can we visit these virtual worlds? Are they are they available now?
We have our first demo actually, so we are hoping to have a beta release pretty soon.
Fantastic.
So
Will that be in New York or?
Oh, definitely. I'm going to put our websites here so that people can reach out.
I'd like to invite all of the panelists too to rejoin us now for a conversation. If people can share their video and unmute themselves, that'd be fantastic. So many great presentations. I feel like I have a million things that I'd love to talk about, but not as much time, of course, to cover everything. But thank you everyone for your presentations today. Richard, too, if you'd like to join us for this conversation, that'd be fantastic as well. Just going to see if all of our other panelists are
Sure.
back on board.
We
Just
have a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Waiting for a couple of the panelists to come back online.
I think they can't open their cameras or their audio for some reason. Maybe you can help them.
My audio goes, but my camera doesn't go. It says that the admin has to let me go.
Admins, Kenya, Illya. Yeah.
There we go.
Excellent. We're all back.
Jola can't turn on her camera.
Jola's not back.
Jola, there she is. Okay.
And I think,
by the way, you guys were great, folks. You guys were great. Thank you. Thank you very much. This was, planning this and seeing all of these panelists come together, and it exceeded my wildest expectations. So thank you all.
Yes.
Thank you. This was great. It's so interesting hearing everybody's ideas. I really think that there's like a lot of, I feel like together we can, like, we all, like, in this room, solve it, guys. Let's do
Zoom
this.
room.
Right.
Yeah, so many fantastic ideas. I guess we do have a couple questions in the Q&A panel, but I think if Richard and I had any questions too, just to kick things off, that'd be great. One of my questions was something that I just noticed. Nobody mentioned the storm surge gate that's being proposed for Jamaica Bay. Nobody mentioned these infrastructure projects that are already being proposed for the Bay. Is that something that we've just sort of skipped beyond? Like, are the billions of dollars that are being proposed for infrastructure, for storm surge barriers on the Bay, and for walls and levees around the city, is that something that the panel kind of agrees is not really feasible or even necessary? We all moved on to retreat and we skipped over infrastructure solutions for the most part.
I mean, I'm coming from a perspective as somebody who's from a place where we can't retreat, right? And so that makes my perspective, a little different. We don't really have an option, even if we wanted to. The vast majority of people in Jamaica, the island, don't even have passports or could get a visa. So I feel like managed retreat is something we definitely need to consider, and we definitely need to look at how we can make where we live safer. But we also have to consider that, again, and I've lived in the United States for most of my country. Most of my life, I am an American citizen as well. But we are largely responsible, guys, for this problem in the world. And we cannot just retreat our way out of it, save ourselves, and leave everybody else to drown. That is not right. So I think we need to do the most we can with what we have in the places that we have to make them as safe as possible. And by extension, I think somebody mentioned COVID. This is not going to be, even if we manage to retreat and save ourselves, like just hypothetically, everybody else is going to be knocking at our door. We're going to have a massive refugee problem, right? And wars over resources, et cetera. So I do think, we need to think really carefully about the strategies that we use to manage and mitigate climate change.
Nathan, can I add to that? Oh, go
Yeah,
ahead.
definitely, please.
No, I was just going to add that, like, there's not one solution. And I didn't raise the Army Corps project because I think it's a good or a bad solution per se, just as I mentioned managed retreat because that was kind of in the prompt. But I think we need an incredible variety of solutions. And the big problem in having this conversation is presenting it as a binary rather than a broad spectrum. But I'll pass it.
Maybe we could call it selective retreat.
I think there may be, from my perspective, like certainly there is a parcel or there may be a street where it doesn't make sense to have a structure there because it's just really, really challenging. But when we talk about like vast geographies, like that's huge amounts of people, place, and experience to just neglect. I don't know. I think there are a lot of tools out there, and in some ways we're hindered by both our own imagination and our own a little bit of a sense of whimsy and romanticism.
I see a couple of the other panelists have their hands up too. William, I think you put your hand up there first.
Well, I was just thinking about your question about the infrastructure. I mean, the barrier on Jamaica Bay. I mean, that was initially proposed, in response to Hurricane Donna in 1960, and the Corps drew up the plan in 1965. Basically the same thing. So it's been on their agenda for a while. I guess the question, is, what stage will it actually move forward? But I think your point, and similarly, the larger harbor barrier, needs to be really critically evaluated in terms of its, value. I mean, I think you stated it well. How to develop a system that's, and others Deborah mentioned too, that's flexible, and then multifaceted. I mean, that the literature really speaks very clearly to that. You need both of those things. And by putting the 20th century is full of horrific mistakes of the tech fix of putting all one's eggs in one basket, and creating either a false sense of security, or a lot of uneven sort of risk protection behind it. So it's really an interesting question. I mean, we're 10 years on from Sandy, and while we've done some significant development, and maybe the Lower East Side, the park issue, and the development of the transmorphed vision of the big U and how it's translating into sort of Lower Manhattan protection, continues to unfold. It's really interesting, as I guess we've all been watching it over the past decade, and sort of recognizing that this process moves particularly slowly, and one would hope it be particularly efficient and progressive, but it's still in a state of becoming, and I'm not sure we're quite getting to the point that we want it to be at.
Jola, did you want to add on to that as well?
Yeah, I just had a little idea, but I think what Vanessa and Bill and Deborah said, certainly what they said is spot on. But even during your own presentation, and Nathan, you had mentioned that, whether you or Reza had mentioned that sudden sea level rise, let's say we have 5 meter sea level rise, some of these constructions may not be enough. And so when you invest that much money, billions of dollars, and then in 30 years or in 40 years, it's something that people have to remove, then it becomes a problem. And so the question is, what is the strategic or the most efficient way to spend the dollars we have now, and who is going to benefit from that dollar? So the infrastructure, if you put on the storms, if you put on the sea level, sea walls, who is going to be benefiting from it, and who is being relocated? And so the different toolbox that we have, I think, are important, a variety of strategies. But the question is, who is particular strategy serving, and who is losing out of those strategies? That's something else to center in our thinking around all of these options. But certainly there should be a consideration, a variety of options on how to move forward.
It makes absolutely no sense to invest all that money in the infrastructure if we're not doing anything to decarbonize and to change the way, otherwise it's like you have a hole in the boat and you're bailing, what's the point? So we do need to stop the carbon economy.
Yeah.
We have about 8 years left, and we actually have to do something significant this year if we want to have any hope in terms of scaling back. And rather than scaling back, there's more investment. Your tax dollars are going to fund this destruction. The fossil fuel industry is heavily subsidized. So some of this has to do with, political will, and with people saying, hey, this is coming down the pike, and this is an issue that needs to be addressed. We need to change our energy economy.
Yes.
But Vanessa, I think there's one real great thing that we have to discuss here. We talk about carbon. I'm a fellow architect, and we've got the 2030 commitment, and we're driving carbon down. But carbon is not going to stop the train. The train's left the station. We are going to blow past 2 degrees. So mitigation through carbon reduction, great, all for it, and do that in my practice. But what we're really missing is complete adaptation and resilient building. And so when I think about the barrier, it's an engineered piece of resilience that is not adaptive. So that, to me, that's a false direction to go. But what we are missing is disaster risk reduction globally that needs to take place wholesale. And part of that is this larger geography to really understand that we do need to make major moves. The Band-Aids that are being put into place, which I referenced and many of the presentations showed today, they only push the timeline back to make a clear area for major decisions.
Yeah.
But we do need to be clear that carbon reduction doesn't take care of methane. Methane 10 times the destructive force of carbon, and we can't stop that unless we stop the entire melting of the ice cap and all of those elements. So the train's left the station. We've got to really look at adaptation and disaster risk reduction.
Yes, but I want to emphasize that the barrier is not, first of all, this is something that's being used in the Netherlands, and it's actually very successful. It's part of a larger approach that is multifaceted rather than just one thing. The other thing I ask everybody here, as somebody from the global South, it is not acceptable to me to say, you know, yes, okay, fine, the train has left the station. I am not willing to give up my country for this. I am not willing to say, oh, well, you know, I don't have that option. My family doesn't have that option.
Oh, I agree with you.
So as Americans, we need to take responsibility. We're the ones who drilled the oil and made the technology.
Agreed. And as I said, there were three parts to this. I agree with you, and sorry to interrupt you. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. We've got to keep on the carbon reduction wholeheartedly, but we cannot not recognize the other two aspects of this, which will have the most incredible impact in the shortest amount of time, which is disaster risk reduction, as we draw down on our carbon footprint.
I think we need to do everything all together. Right? Yeah. Because, you know, we're going to have so many disasters that we're not going to be able to address all of them. But yeah. I am not, you know, I speak for people of the global South, for people who, the people who are the most vulnerable are people who look like me and Jola. They're people who live in flood zones. So it is a huge, huge luxury as Americans for us to sit here and talk about managed retreat as we let the rest of the world drown. Sorry. I'm not pointing you out specifically. I'm saying me also as an American. Quite frankly, this is bullshit. And sorry, like, we cannot let this happen. We cannot just say it's okay and that we're just going to let it happen, because a lot of people are not going to be okay even at 2 degrees. And guess what? Right. If we do that at 4 degrees, the United States is not going to exist. And guess what? Let's not even talk about the geopolitical. Okay, what we're moving into, if we continue down that road, is we're moving into 2 superpowers, Canada and Russia. That's what we'll have. The United States, we're going to be refugees going to Canada. Maybe we can all fit into Alaska. I don't know.
This is a question. This is a question for the panel as well. Just something that came up. Something that
just go to Canada.
You don't want us.
I have the same Canada. Passion, Vanessa, which is just because just thinking of the $1.2 billion that were given to Stanford to create a climate school this week, just focused on decarbonization. There's so little investment from our country in adaptation and actually making meaningful transformation in people who are feeling risk now, whether it be in Jamaica, in anywhere. And I think it's deeply problematic to talk about managed retreat, but I think also having a conversation completely focused on decarbonization misses the point that if we went to zero tomorrow, there'd still be 30 years of incredibly severe consequences for.
I don't know where this has come from, but I haven't said that I'm only focused on decarbonization at all. So
no, well, it's just
I think we all agree though.
I gave a speech that was not in favor of retreat. So
I think maybe the problem is even just the terminology of managed retreat. I sort of feel like selective retreat would be better, where you can sort of see, okay, you know, maybe your house needs to be on stilts and maybe your house needs to move. And maybe this, you know, maybe I like the idea in Jola's presentation, I think, where you talked about, or maybe I'm sorry, maybe it was not yours, maybe it was someone else, where there's the neighbors can like use the land, but they've moved somewhere else. That's actually, I think, a really nice idea. And I liked that, you know, that a lot of you were talking also about the sort of sociological impacts and the, you know, the cultural and political impacts of moving and how difficult that can be. I mean, my parents are both sociologists, so that's, you know, something that's kind of deeply rooted in me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask all the panelists, sort of bring it back to looking specifically at Jamaica Bay and New York City. It's still not even clear to me, like we have been talking about the idea of managed retreat. It doesn't even seem like necessarily feasible that, from what you're describing, that we can do large scale managed retreats. How would New York City undergo a massive large scale retreat of millions of people? How would the East Coast of the United States retreat? Like where would millions of people go just from here in this city? And I think that is a valid question to ask. Like, is it even feasible to be thinking about this? Like the examples that I gave in my paper are like very small neighborhoods on the coast of Staten Island or in Ramblersville, a dozen houses being demolished. But we're talking about a city with, almost 9 million people, and a coast here with millions more. So yeah, is retreat even like a viable strategy?
One thing was, could I jump in here for a sec?
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, if you look at the 2020 census, of course, like, people are moving more and more to the coasts, right? So the issue, we're not like going in the right direction. I mean, you can look at all the census data, like, Florida, states where they're going to be more in the crosshairs, and of course, property values along coastal areas are increasing. I guess one of the tensions that I thought was really very stark that came up after Sandy was the different approaches. So you mentioned the Staten Island example. So that was the state of New York, obviously. And they basically said, we're coming in and we're going to level this and we're going to, make it into a park. The city of New York, very different approach. We're going to buy out properties, we're going to hold them and then use them for reinvestment. It was sort of their basic approach. The recognition of the utility of the shoreline. And I guess, one of the things that's sort of, I really appreciated Jola's sort of perspective, specifically that example of continuing to get use of the properties, once folks are relocated. I don't, in the context of, New York City, the dominance of private property, et cetera, I mean, those kinds of arrangements are, to your point, are going to be really much more challenging. And, I think that you see along the Jersey Shore post-Sandy, in other places sort of post-extreme events, this sort of process of redevelopment, which in some cases, leads to, a shift in the process of development. And, so typically low to moderate income residents are dislocated, and there's sort of this reinvestment, of wealthier residents. So what am I trying to say? I guess it's like, that's sort of the development model that we've built up. So, it becomes this larger systemic question. How do you kind of, break into that development model? And obviously this is not even like considering the hundreds of thousands of folks that already live in these floodplain areas, that are kind of deeply embedded, like their property is basically their primary investment. Or if they're renters, they have like minimal capacity to kind of resist landlord changes and so forth. So it's in that larger systemic space that it really becomes challenging to do to envision a managed retreat process.
Deborah, I think your hand is up.
Yes. So I manage New York City's buyout and acquisition program, and I can share stories of soup to nuts, the experience of both what happens to a physical piece of property and that transition and becoming from someone's home to either open space or potentially, ideally in the future, some other community use or a more resilient house, but also the like relocation process of finding new housing, both for an owner or for a tenant. And I think looking at managed retreat as sort of a retail service delivery of like, oh, you just help this person find a house from A to B is very minimizing to the like challenge of like, where do we live and how? And when you look at the regional problem of what, like, New York City is a city of 8.5 million in a broader region of, depending on where you draw the lines, 20 million, where with, New Jersey and Long Island having Westchester having significant coastal risks as well. You're really looking at a question, if you're saying where retreat, like there is nowhere to go than some other place in the country, which has some other climatic or physical challenge.
Yeah.
So you can have a discussion about are there tactical reasons that a particular site has vulnerability that makes it, that's not solvable through technology we have now, or we think we could have, or through some sociocultural relationship to that physical risk? That's one question you can have, but like to totally eliminate risk by thinking you can walk away from it, I think really minimizes the challenge, and also minimizes like what it is to be humans. Like nature, like the way we discuss ecology and nature, that is a human and social construction. So it's not just about, you know, letting the water in, it's our relationship with water. And I bring up the amphibious cars and lots of other ways of living with water and water risk, and Illya can give a whole presentation on houses that different kinds of houses that can deal with flood risk. But like that's part of the challenge. Like our buildings may need to look different, and we don't subsidize housing really equitably or at all in the United States. So if we're adding to construction costs, how do we do that equitably and build a different city, state, region, country, world, since those costs are going to be different and require a different kind of skill and sophistication to build?
I'd like to ask everyone a question, because I think when you're trying to solve a problem as big as this, or any problem, you really need to start out with dreaming big and imagining your way into a potential future. And I feel like we might be all sort of so far into the weeds in our respective disciplines that we're sort of looking at like how things can't work, or what the problems might be with it, with our current system that we have. And I think what we're kind of realizing through this conversation, which is interesting, is that you guys are Jamaicans too. Guess what? You can't retreat. You can't. Maybe it's not really possible, right? So maybe running away is not a solution, which may mean we need to stay and fight. And if we need to stay and fight, that means that we're going to have to use our natural born ingenuity and figure this stuff out. So what I'd like to ask everybody is, what would you do if you could not retreat? And don't think about how it won't work, or the government, or any stuff like that. Like what would we do? And don't think about any limitations. Just like, let's put it out there. What would we do? What does everybody think? I'm curious.
Well, I don't know if I can answer that, but I live in a neighborhood in this particular city on this particular coast that I'm about 60 feet above sea level rise. So if I couldn't retreat, the place that I'm currently renting, not owning, if I was allowed to live here, theoretically, I would survive anything but the most like ridiculous amounts of sea level rise and tsunamis. And parts of the coast of the United States and the east coast of the United States will survive from sea level rise, even if we don't do anything. So
I don't mean individually. I mean, if you could create a world in which, if you could do anything to save New York City, Jamaica Bay, all of it, right? What would that be? What would that look like?
Oh, the bigger picture. I'm a big advocate of E.O. Wilson's half Earth idea, where we need to actually retreat from half of the Earth and give half of the Earth back to other species in order to maintain the biodiversity that supports this planet.
That's what we've done in my book.
Bigger picture for me would be, that is a retreat in a sense, but really taking a radical approach to supporting the other ecosystems and species on this planet. Other panelists?
I think, Illya, you had your hand up before me.
Oh, sure. Vanessa, great question. And I love what Nathan put forward, because I totally agree. The work that we're doing now is about total regenerative practices. So everything that we do has to repair the earth and increase capacity. So how do we begin to look at a uniqueness of place, understand its biocapacity and its former capacity, restore to that capacity, and then try to go beyond? And there's some great examples around the world that are doing it, like Singapore. You build a building, you have to actually support 4 times the biocapacity of the site as if there was no building there in the first place, as a minimum standard. So I would totally invest in that kind of regenerative practice in my own house, in my own community. and try to bring that forward, because you're right on. The only way we're going to turn this around is to realize that the extractive economy, we're on this line and we have to change the line to increase capacity. So I love what Nathan said. And just to add to that is go to a regenerative way of thinking. That would be so awesome.
Yeah, I really like this idea of regenerative thinking, but I think not everybody is retreating or relocating. There are people who are accommodating, building their house in ways that actually allows for flooding. And so we've seen that all across the world. But also another thing that I would talk about is some examples from India where the land actually disappears and then a new island appears as well. So it's not about just people trying to respond to impacts of climate change. The Earth system itself is also shifting and changing. And so you see sand appearing and sand disappearing. And so how do you respond to some of the challenges that is happening on the Earth side of the system, but also the human side? And then the third element for me is, in many parts of the US, even if you think about Florida, where you have the wealthy homes, you have homes where you have giant homes and you have two people living in those giant homes, especially along the coast. That is not a viable system for anybody. Yeah. And so when we're thinking about retreat, actually should be thinking about retreating the wealthy people from the coast. It's not really the poor people that live on the coast. I can afford to live on the coast anyway. It's too expensive. But at the end of the day, it's really the poor people somehow that they're the ones, and not just poor. I mean, low income. By poor, I mean low income. And I mean also people of particular races that gets relocated. And so accommodation, retreat, resistance, all kinds of strategies need to be on the table for sure. But also the regenerative practices that Illya talks about, I think will be helpful going in the future. We just need to bring everything to the table and see what works for different groups of people.
Deborah, did you want to add to that too?
Yeah, I was gonna, and sort of visioning what my New York City would be. I think it would look incredibly different, because it's not just would my house, my rental apartment flood, but all of the service and infrastructure that serves my house and my family and my grandparents and my parents and grandparents might flood. So there's the way the city connects and the political system right now that is, I think in some early question in the chat from Roland, like all of that needs to transform. So it's not just a built environment question. I think it's about imagining a totally different like social political construct, as well as a different physical environment, which manages floodwater, is more responsive and made out of materials that can handle extreme temperature fluctuations, can handle and manage waste thoughtfully and well.
I think also one thing that is kind of like the elephant in the room is that capitalism isn't really working anymore either, is it? That's a huge part of the problem, right? And so when we try to envision our way out of this with the current way that the world is working, it doesn't work. But if we can free ourselves from that construct and think, okay, how could we live differently? How could we live better? How could we share resources? Because the climate crisis doesn't stop at borders. And initially we thought that we could just retreat inland, but guess what? We have inland hurricanes now. I used to think, well, I could come to Philadelphia where my parents live if New York goes under, but Philadelphia just had catastrophic flooding. The entire, the part of the highway that's sunken on the Vine Street Expressway was like a complete lake, right? So that's not safe either. There are places that are now full of fire. So each place is going to have its own challenges. It's not just a matter of retreating from the coast. So I really think what we need to do is use all of these wonderful ideas that have been developed that are actually separated because they're all siloed. Everyone is sort of researching independently. And what we really need to do is come together, share ideas, and be solutions oriented. I mean, I think, I don't know. That's just my 2 cents.
William, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously lots of great stuff that's been said. I was thinking about, Jamaica Bay, again, in terms of like, I mean, we're talking about these larger systemic issues, which I, agree that we need to get into that space. And when we were there's attempts to do it, and there's of course demands to do it. But I'm thinking about, and maybe this is sort of a little bit of a riff on Vanessa's question in terms of what to do, but specifically, and maybe you tried to do this as well, to Jamaica Bay. One of the things that I mean, there's a lot of community experimentation with community empowerment, right? Participatory budgeting. I know that's also been really advanced in some cases, where communities get the right and capacity to make decisions about their own futures. Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of these things boil down to issues of power and who has the capacity to make decisions, and who's granted that power, and who accepts that power, and who uses that power. And I think for a lot of the communities in Jamaica Bay, they've long felt that they haven't had that power. And I think that we need to sort of really, dramatically enhance the capacity for experimentation, or expand the things that we're already doing, like participatory budgeting, and others, in the context of resiliency efforts. I mean, for the short term. I think for the long term, we have to get into sort of larger systemic issues, things we've been discussing. But this sort of stuff is really at least front and center in my mind of what's possible in the next few years in Jamaica Bay.
Yeah, Illya, did you want to add on to that?
I just wanted to add something said by Deborah, Vanessa, and Bill collectively. Back to that question Roland posted. Vanessa's right on. The disasters don't respect political boundaries, but they also don't respect the term limits of the political season. And that is the systemic issue that Bill's bringing up, because quite frankly, it's going to take a serious catastrophe beyond anything we've seen. If you go to the Tohoku disaster in Japan, they had to change fundamentally an entire region for managed retreat, rethinking entire societal norms to rebuild an entire region. And they had the money of trillions of dollars to do it, is the catastrophe of the after event. How do we get to a place where it's a master plan to a regional level that is held accountable to the people who will use it over generations and generations? And that doesn't exist in this country, and it rarely exists anyplace else. So I agree about the short term, and the long term is always the challenge. We can keep doing these studies, and the studies that we're doing that show that there are places of less risk, greater capacity, all of those things. But do those become exploitive areas rather than places that we can support fundamental societal growth away from hazard? That's a question.
I wanted to take a quick look at one of the questions from the audience here that just, I think, sort of touches on this and how New York City might be going almost in the wrong direction in some ways in terms of capitalism and development. It's a question from Mike DeLong at Riverkeeper. This is something I look at in my paper as well, but Mike DeLong asks, Professor Keith's projections and designs for the Gowanus Canal are at odds with the city's recent rezoning, which will bring additional population density to the banks of the Gowanus Canal. This increase in shoreline density is happening all over the city. And what is there to do in the short term to stop or slow this practice? I mean, this is something that I'm seeing citywide. We know the projections for sea level rise. We know what neighborhoods flooded in Sandy, what neighborhoods are going to flood again, and we're investing millions. We're allowing developers, but the city itself is investing millions and billions of dollars into bringing tens of thousands of people right into these same flood zones on the Gowanus Canal. You're going to have tens of thousands of new residents on the coast of the East River in Long Island City and Williamsburg. You're going to have tens of thousands of new apartments and people moving right into areas that are projected to be underwater. So at the same time, we're having this discussion about managed retreats and envisioning a future city. The city itself is doubling down on putting more people in harm's way and in at-risk areas. So maybe you can talk about that.
I think, well, it's not a perfect example, but I think there's an interesting example if you look at Fire Island and some of the towns there. And essentially, if you have your house close enough to the water and your house is destroyed in a storm, it reverts back to the national park and you cannot rebuild it, which is, I guess, as a society, we're going to have to ask ourselves, like, if we are building and we are put, the insurance industry is a really interesting question in this, in terms of, is it only going to be the very wealthy who can afford to rebuild these things? Are we, is the rest of society willing to subsidize rebuilding and rebuilding and rebuilding these places that are built in areas of high risk? It seems like a lot of these things are actually like also, like high end rather than poverty in the way that we have in lots of the global South. So I don't know. I mean, I think, do we have to wait for a major calamity? Maybe, maybe not. I think I don't claim to have all of the answers, but I do think that we need to think beyond the box that we've put ourselves in terms of the current systems that we have and the way that things are working. And one thing that I think could be, okay, so people can ask, why does Germany recycle so much stuff? Why do they have like 79% of their stuff gets recycled? And I think 6% of our stuff gets recycled, if that. Well, they make corporations, if you put something out in the world, you've got to take it back and deal with it. So if I manufacture something and it comes in a plastic bottle, I have to figure out what to do with it when you're done with it. So some of those things, some of the responsibility can be passed back to the polluters or whoever is generating the problem. And some of this also has to do with the fossil fuel industry.
I want to take a quick pause here and say that there's been a couple of questions from the panel and from the audience about when we're going to open it up to the larger conversation. This Q&A has been fantastic, and we were going to end it at 3 o'clock. I know we're a little past 3 o'clock because it's been such a fascinating conversation. But Richard, this could be a great time to open it up to this round.
I was just sitting here quietly.
Yeah.
I was just enjoying this. And yes, we will, but there's a lot of activity in the chat and in the Q&A.
Yeah, there's a lot of great questions people are asking, and we'd like to, I think it'd be a time to open it up.
Opening it up. And, one of the things I kept saying to myself as this conversation was going on was, see, this is why we only did this little slice of a little part of New York and a little one of its boroughs in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn communities of Jamaica Bay, because it is such an expansive topic. And of course, you really can't do what I, tried to do, is like box it off and just limit it to these communities of Jamaica Bay. But one of the things I did want to, I think we can see is that, it is, what is it? It's synecdoche, where you have one piece can stand for the whole. And so you have in this community of Canarsie, let's say, which is, we have a scientist telling us about the effects of sea level rise. We have social problems where we hear about the systemic racism that caused a housing crisis in that community of color of Canarsie because of these predatory loaning practices of the early 2000s. And this place does have in miniature all these forces. So climate change, injustice, the problems with capitalism gone wild, Vanessa. And we see all this in one place. So, okay, I'm going to open it up and let's see what kinds of questions we have. I noticed one I liked early. I saw this, and I think this goes to a question that we have to face is, what are the causes? How do we ever get things done? And this is from Roland Lewis, who is the former director of the Waterfront Alliance. So he's familiar with all these questions. And he says, here's my question. How do you solve the paradox of the unstoppable force of climate change with the immovable object of short-sighted political thinking? To frame the question, I'll cite two mayors. Bloomberg, a leader who was at the end of the term and cared deeply about the issue of climate change, yet, as Illya pointed out, said that he would not consider moving back from the rising seas in the wake of Sandy. And before him, Mayor Koch, who made the astute political observation asking why should he invest in long-term infrastructure, which would only result in his successor, likely his worst enemy, cutting the ribbon and getting the credit. So I don't know, anybody have any response or reaction to that? I just thought it, given the context and trying to get things done, that that sort of isolated a few of the issues. Anybody now? Anyone from the audience? I'm going to let Ariel explain how you can get your voice heard, not just through a chat voice. And so while we are talking, but she will explain how to get that in. She will unmute you and invite you and get you on this screen. Go ahead, Ariel.
Okay, so it is a webinar format. So obviously we have the panelist view and then there's the audience view that can participate in the chat. If you would, we are able to promote people from attendee to a panelist. So if you would like to participate, you could either write in the chat or raise your hand using the raise your hand feature at the bottom of your screen, right next to the Q&A box. And me or Jasmine will be able to promote you to join the screen.
Okay, there's at least one person doing that already.
Yeah, this is meant to be sort of the roundtable discussion part of the day. So certainly if you want to be able to speak out loud, we can elevate you and you can speak up, join the conversation, not just in the chat box.
I'm attempting to promote people. If there's any issue, let me know. I think it sometimes has a lag time.
Here's one question: elect women. That's how you get these things done. Okay. Concerned that my Asian neighbors will not recycle because they say until India, Russia, and China come out of the pre-industrial revolutionary practices, our attempts will continue to be diminished. Okay, so that's that was a bit of tongue-in-cheek. I'm not sure women would really be better, said the writer of that statement. Okay. Illya, you have your hand raised, so let's recognize you while we get some.
Sure. Thanks, Richard. A couple of things that come to mind in the short term to that specific question from Roland. And I think we started to talk about it at the end of the panel. You know, one thing that New York City kind of missed the boat on is a true comprehensive plan. We have a comprehensive waterfront plan, but a master plan for the city of New York. Although I know a lot of people at city planning, some are on the side that it is something that is constraining for creative growth. However, a short-term or short-sighted plan kind of go hand in hand. If you have something that has a long-term impact and assessment and a goal that really is to the 20, 30, 40, 50-year time horizon, you are working towards that. And once it's adopted, then each governing body, whether it's a short-term mayor or whatnot, is really working towards that, and the budget needs to align to that. So that's one mechanical piece that I think we kind of missed the boat on. Another one is that I really think that the Regional Planning Association, along with geographers, it's great to have so many map geeks on like myself, that drainage basins and geographic systems that really support livelihood are often split by political boundaries and then therefore governed inefficiently to the benefit of vitality of communities. And we need to have a real rethink about the geographic systems at play that are the pulmonary systems that support our cities. And that has always been something that is near and dear to my heart. We often see all the maps that we showed today. We see New York City maybe in its 5 boroughs, but New Jersey is just as affected as we are from every one of these storms and all those pieces, as is Long Island and all the surrounding areas. And so even in the way that we present our work, we're not looking at it in the geographic sense that is all encompassing, so therefore invite solutions on a larger scale. So that's a brief kind of look at one, the short-term New York City mechanics and governance, and the other one is just from the geographer side, geographic solutions based in what the environment has to offer.
Okay, thank you. I see two hands. So first, Robin Michaels, and then Maria Garrett, one of our panelists, and we have Roland Lewis is here. Okay, so Robin and Maria and Roland.
Hi, it's been a wonderful day and a great discussion. I just want to give a shout out to the Parks Department. You know, the Parks Department considers themselves to be on the front line of defending New York City communities from climate change. It's in their policy documents, and I think it's in the actual work that they do. About 10 years ago, I believe that, for example, Canarsie Park was built to have a basin to collect rainwater in event of really heavy rains. And they have the Greenbelt Native Plant Center where they're growing native plants and restoring ecosystems around the city. So I think there's a lot of really positive work that's being done that's making a huge difference. And then on another point, having just walked around all of the neighborhoods from Gerritsen Beach to Spring Creek, I mean, Gerritsen Beach was hit so badly in Sandy, and honestly, 2 years before was pretty ratty, right? It was a forgotten neighborhood. If you walk around there, it is beautiful. Many homes have been razed, the streets are being repaved. I mean, the city's putting a good amount of money into infrastructure. I truly believe there's a lot of things that can be done to protect Brooklyn's Jamaica Bay communities.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. Maria.
Yes, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to this conference today. I told Jasmine I was not going to be on all day, but I was fascinated by all the information. And Vanessa, I want to thank you for what you said. We can't retreat. Where are we going to retreat to? I mean, I run a civic organization and I constantly tell the residents of Canarsie, they expected for us to run once after Sandy, because Canarsie was the last community that got any resources. We didn't get anything. We wasn't even on the map as far as Sandy was concerned. And that's why I started the civic organization, because one of the elected officials told us that we was not included in anything because we didn't have an organization to speak for us. And that's the last thing that you could tell Maria Garrett, that you don't have anybody to speak for you. Because regardless of the scientists, and I know Roland, I met you many years ago when I started advocating for my waterfront community, okay? And I'm gonna stay, I'm gonna fight, but one thing we have to teach the residents in the communities, that we cannot have a concrete jungle. And that's the reason why we flood so much, is because everybody wants to pave their homes. They don't want trees in front of their homes. And I explained to them, listen, you need trees that would absorb the water, okay? That absorb a lot of the water. And I was looking at in front of my home just yesterday of all the trees that was damaged during Sandy in the area. My block, we didn't lose but maybe 1 or 2 trees. The trees have sustained Sandy because they came in and they said, once the rainwater starts to wash out the salt water, the trees is going to flourish. The trees have flourished. And I was just looking at it yesterday. The trees are beautiful. So we have to teach the people in the communities to get rid of those concrete jungles.
Yes.
Thank you.
I mean, I think
Thank you.
I think your comment, Maria, is really, really on point, and also Robin. And I was just thinking, like, as you guys were talking about how we're talking about managed retreat in such a big way, but maybe what we need is more kind of like a surgical retreat within communities. So I think, like Illya had mentioned, areas that are designed to flood. There's a really great park in Denmark by, what's his name? CF Muller, I think, designed it. And it's designed to flood. And it's a beautiful community resource when it's not raining. And when it's flooding, that place takes the water, so the water doesn't go to your house. So things like that might be something that we could do even on a community level so that we can mitigate our risk in place.
I believe that Catherine Bridges is the name of the landscape architect working for the Parks Department that designed Canarsie Park to be a basin.
Yeah.
These things in our city. It's wonderful they have them in Denmark, but we have them here too.
Yes, we need more of that. And I agree with Maria about people paving things over. I mean, I'm an architect, and we constantly have to tell people when, what the city does is, you're doing a renovation, you need to go for an Alt 1. You need to file, you need to set, you need to have a site plan. And if you don't have certain areas of planting, if your thing is all concreted up, they will make you jackhammer that away and plant stuff so that it can absorb water. But we need to do more of that, and we need it to happen faster.
And that's what the city was doing at one time. The city was making sure that when they put in new building structure, that they have some place to do planting. It's not all concrete. But of course, when the administrations change over, they don't have the same idea of climate change.
Yeah, remember there was the Bloomberg plan of planting, 1 million or 3 million trees, whatever. Thank you. So Roland, let's, you have had your hand raised for a while, and then Bill and Felix.
All right, well, first of all, Richard, good to see you and a lot of old friends.
Good to see you.
Really enjoyed much of what I was able to capture today, and particularly out this last panel. I'll apologize to the panel because that was as close to a rhetorical question as I could probably muster. I've been trying to answer it for 12 years and failed. But I just wanted to give the best answer I heard, because I would ask it often. What's the political solution to this incredibly important problem? And it was Susanna Drake, our friend, the landscape architect. And she said, what she said that really stuck with me was that she looked toward the Intercontinental Railroad in the 19th century and said that, which was a massive infrastructure project and it was, it may rub us the wrong way, but it was the profit motive and the greed that motivated and allowed for this important economic development project to succeed. So maybe, and I think you guys were toying with us, playing with us during the discussion. Where is that economic incentive for us to find a long-term, profitable climate solution that will build the infrastructure or incentivize the retreat, et cetera? So I'll leave that just as a little bit of Susanna's with you, and any ideas that you all can think of that would make the economics work for reconfiguring our shorelines and cities in the face of climate change.
Okay, thank you. A question, it's out there. Anybody before we go on to Bill and then Felix? They want to handle that? Okay, Bill. Well, and then Felix.
And actually, Roland's comment makes me think about some other things with the city. I mean, the city of New York is actually, at least from my perspective, an example of where this sort of long-term visioning played a huge role. I mean, we look at the water supply system of the city of New York. I mean, just absolutely, mammoth. The subway system was built out into potato fields, through Queens, with the idea of the expansive growth, and then also, of course, the grid itself. There's few examples, on the planet in terms of urban structure and planning than the Manhattan grid as an innovative approach. So New York, it's certainly bound in its history. The question is, there's other reasons why, but this capacity for planning has not at large scales has not been executed, right? And there's lots of reasons we stumble into that space. That being said, one of the mechanisms that I think is kind of interesting, and I wasn't there, I was there a little bit when Brett was moderating, but Brett Branco, but maybe, the question was also asked earlier about what is possible, what are mechanisms? And I think one of the things that we see in the literature and in practice are these sort of boundary organizations. So the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, warts and all, and I've been involved with it a lot, has really been, to me, a great source of experimentation and sort of bringing together, this is to Illya's point as well, like, harmonizing these disparate communities along the bay that were once much more bound together than they have been in recent decades, but kind of reconnecting them not only to the bay, but to each other through dialogue, through discussion, through planning exercises, through, emergent sort of access to knowledge. So these sort of boundary organizations at multiple neighborhood scales, I think, are proving as a useful example. And again, hats off to SRIJB and of course your organization as well, Richard. But I mean, in terms of practice and everyday engagement with the Bay, I think that they're really an example of like the cutting edge stuff that we could imagine in other sites, not only in New York, but other cities as well.
Okay, thank you. Felix.
Thank you, sir. Thank you everyone for your awesome presentations, your conference. Super informative. I've been here since the start this morning. I have to say, climate change to me it's still a new issue. I've been studying it, since maybe 2009, and there's so much that I'm still learning. But I know that today we're leap years ahead of where we were 10 years ago as far as data is concerned. And we know that sea level rise is a natural phenomenon. And the thing is, it's happening more rapidly now because of our doings in the last couple of 100 years. So time is definitely of the essence. So I feel like we definitely have to move swiftly and finding synergistic solutions between humanity and the earth. So we were talking about forest fires, right? The reason we're having forest fires is because, centuries ago, the indigenous people actually maintained the forest. They burned, rubbish every day to maintain the forest. But when they were moved out, and then the land was used for lumber, we started to we thought we were doing the right thing by actually planting more trees. But what we actually did was we made the land too dense. We made the area too dense. And that's why we have all these fires right now, because all these trees are too close to each other. And that's happening because we don't understand the land, right? So I just want to say that, wherever we migrate to, it's important that, we put all this information we have together and really understand the spaces we move into. I just want to show you also my model. This is my 3D model of Jamaica Bay. I was actually studying the Bay when I was in graduate school. So
wow.
So I totally understand this area. I was studying the caverns, so
wow.
I hold this area to heart. So yeah.
Great. Okay,
Thank
so
you,
this
thank
was
you.
important for you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Felix. And by the way, I want to mention that each year, Felix organizes an event at the college called Echo Fest, and he had that just about a week and change ago. And it is a bringing together of people talking about very important topics at City Tech at our college. And he involves students in the projects. And I know that Illya's students at the college make these great videos. So congratulations to you and your work, Felix.
Thank you, and thank you, for always joining us every year. And thank you, Ariel. We appreciate you so much. Thank you. This is great information we're sharing, and let's keep doing it. This is important information. We just have to find a way to spread it out wider and faster.
Okay, good. Ariel, do you want to go before Dawn, or shall Dawn go first? You have something?
I think Dawn, you can go ahead.
I would just like to say that nobody's experienced coastal flooding more than me. I'm a survivor of 3 hurricanes, and 2 nor'easters, and 1 event called Syzygy, 1989, when all the planets were in alignment. And it was a calm day like today, but I had 1.5 foot of water in my house. So there's other events that are at play. But I live in a house on pilings, and I see the future. I'm going to have to retreat. I can't build my house up, so I'm going to have to think about eventually moving out. While we had this discussion today, sea level was rising. Nature doesn't take a holiday. So little by little, it's creeping up on us. But maybe we just have to do what you're doing today, get people together, but get all the engineers and the construction experts together and the thinkers, and really get started to start the planning now. And I just say, look at some communities like maybe the Broad Channel community or Ramblersville and so on, may have to leave, eventually. Give people that option anyway, and otherwise you build up. You retreat inland or you build up somehow, and you change the whole topography of the city. But what are you going to do about Wall Street? You're going to have to put a seawall around that. I don't know.
They're trying to.
That's about all you can do. So, but and sometimes when I look at the state of the world today, the craziness of all the people and that nobody gets along, that I become rather pessimistic and say, no matter how much we talk, we're not going to get everybody lockstep to change in time to really solve the problem. So you do what you can, but you can't give up. I mean, no matter what you do in life, you die at the end anyway. But what are you going to do about it? You can't sit back and say, well, I'm going to die. I may as well not do anything. You do what you can. Anyway, thanks for having this today. It was very informative.
Thank you, Don, and thanks for coming, and thank you for your contribution. Really appreciated it. Ariel and then Ju.
Yeah, I think it kind of builds on what a few people have said already. I think for me, one of the things that I really took away from all of the presentations today, and one of the things that I really appreciated from what you all shared, was this kind of topic of things are changing. We know things are changing. They're not changing in a good direction. And so what would it take to change, like to have a different direction? And I think I found some inspiration from what in particularly Jola was presenting about kind of what are the transformative possibilities that we could think about in this moment. And I think part of that, and people again have touched on, is, again, it kind of actually echoes, Don, your point about like, what about Wall Street? And I think it's not the context of physically, geographically and water, but the context of we have a lot of vested interests and a lot of kind of vested status quo and power that is benefiting from how the system currently works. And so what would it take to actually change that? And we know things are going to change. So what would it take to change the status quo rather than just kind of, sea level rise? Because we know sea level rise is happening. And the question is, can we change the status quo of the like who is impacted and who bears the brunt of all those changes? And historically and ongoingly, it is the, like low-income people of color, they are going to bear the brunt of that. And so what would it take to actually change the status quo of this in this kind of conversation? I think something like managed retreat, or that idea, is that you're trying to be proactive. You're trying to think about how to, ideally in an ideal situation, go up against the status quo and redistribute or transform or restore or, so thinking about things like reparations or how kind of a transformative model could be fit in, I think is really important. And I really appreciated the folks who brought that up today, especially.
I think we're going to have to realize that we either have to work together and we have to share, or we're not going to be here anymore. The planet will still be here. The planet has been 6 degrees or more warmer. All of the species that are living here will not be here, neither will we. And I think we need to come to grips with that. I think we've got huge income inequality and huge unfairness in the system and in the way that things are working and who it benefits. And I think we really need to look at that. We really need to realize that we need to share the planet and its resources, not only with each other, but with every other species that has a right to be on this planet that didn't ask for any of this. So I think it really requires a profound shift in the way that we look at our place on the earth and how we live in and with its systems. And so when I'm positing how could cities be different and thinking about like, if as an architect, I'm like the anthill builder of my species, right? Well, anthills biodegrade. They are not like a linear system that doesn't go back to the earth, right? And they're in balance with the rest of the systems of the earth. So if we can start to think about that, and I think that there are a lot of really great people that are thinking about this across different fields. What I see though is that we need to really come together. We need to share information. We need to collaborate. This is not something that one field is going to solve. It's not something that one country is going to solve. And it's something that I think is going to take togetherness and humility and working together to solve problems and a profound shift in the way that we live. At the same time, I think, we have so much to look forward to because this shift is going to be something potentially great in the sense that we can completely rework our energy economy. We can rework the way that we live. This is not working for 99% of the people. We don't really have anything to lose by changing. And there are so many of us. There are many, many, many more of us than there are of the 0.00001% of people who are actually benefiting from this system, which is driving us off a cliff. And even they would not be that happy living in a bunker in a ruined world.
Thank you. And I think the last question of the day will be Ju P.
Hi. Thank you, everybody. This has been really, really great, as everybody has been saying, but it's really inspiring to see a group of people coming together to really trying to figure out what we're going to do. And just, kind of piggybacking after Vanessa, I think that, well, first, I want to just thank you because as a person from Colombia, I know that a lot of these conversations that are had in different places globally, many times miss the fact that the most contaminating countries and the ones that are polluting the most and the ones that have created this crisis are not really looking at this is the mess that we have made. So how we're going to fix it for everybody in the world. And I really appreciated that and just how, inspiringly you were putting that forward over and over again, because I think that needs to be put forward over and over again in any kind of space where we're talking about these solutions. And I'm just thinking like, there are all these great ideas that all of you guys brought forward. And I'm imagining that many people from the audience are also working on these solutions. And I'm just wondering, like we have been talking about, how the lack of political will. I think that Roland was the person that was bringing up the issue of is going to be profitable or not. And we're talking about the systems and the system doesn't work. And so like, we need to like imagine our systems. And I'm here thinking like, we could solve this if we actually force those who have the power to do this in a mass scale to do it, because we have, Vanessa had all these models, like there were all these different ideas from every other panelist and research, and then I'm wondering like, should we just call for a strike and we don't do anything on our industries, we don't go to work until you people who manage this can see an investment or like put forward an investment of millions and millions of dollars so that we can actually start this transition, because I don't see any other way in which, like all the people with the good ideas, are having a lot of trouble in putting them into action in the mass scale that is needed. And so I guess this is a question, but it's also just an affirmation of the kind of action that it's needed right now, because I can see for sure that a lot of these initiatives are being undertaken and are being kind of like put aside just because it's not in the forefront of the people who are running, our economy. So I guess that's my contribution.
Thank you. And I will let that cry from the heart be our last word. I just, if you would, let's see, excuse me here. I'll just close with a few words. I think I can share my screen. Let me see. Can you see that? Oh, can that be seen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So that's the Irish poet William Butler Yeats wrote about a mythical Irish demigod, Cuchulainn. It's hard. I had to listen to Google a million times to get the pronunciation. Cuchulainn. And Yeats's take on this hero is different from the standard versions of the hero and his death. Yeats took liberties with it, but it's Yeats's take that I want to talk about. In Yeats's telling, Cuchulainn finds himself in circumstances where his death comes, and he walks out into the sea, sword in hand, and he battles the waves for 4 days. He battles the waves and the tides. I first came across that image in a play called On Bow Strand that I had to read, I don't know, my first or second year in college. And I had forgotten about that. But when I was putting this together, this conference together, I remembered Cuchulainn, and I didn't remember the spelling. I had to go find it. But I remember Cuchulainn standing there in the waves. And in preparing, it came back to me. And Cuchulainn was brave and foolish and loyal and rash and loving and noble and proud to the point of hubris. And we humans are like that hero. We are Cuchulainn, standing in Jamaica Bay, bravely, nobly, battling the waves and the tides that will overwhelm us. Like Cuchulainn, we're responsible for our fate. We are making that climate change, and now we must face it. But let's not just fight nobly like Cuchulainn. Let's plan and think and use our intelligence, as we've heard all of this today, as well as our nobility, to avoid Cuchulainn's fate of being overwhelmed by the waves and the tides. And so I would thank all of our panelists today for giving us the inspiration to admire Cuchulainn, but not be like him. And so who have given us thoughts and who have been here, and to the audience who stayed and listened to all these presentations. And I hope that we have contributed slightly to a conversation that will be ongoing and to some insights that we have. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your knowledge and your visions with us. That's it. Goodbye. Have a nice weekend.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Started. Recording in progress. There we started. Recording in progress. There we started. Recording in progress.